Tobias McCoy thought it was just a tumor on his horse's leg. But when it burst, what came out wasn't pus or blood. It was something man-made, something no animal should ever carry. And the truth behind it would shake everything he thought he knew. The sun was just cracking over the top of Deadwood Ridge, setting fire to the frost-laced pastures that sprawled across Tobias McCoy's land. The old rancher moved through his morning routine the same way he had for the last 2 decades. Quiet, deliberate, with a kind of reverence that came only from loss and survival. The only sound, aside from the crunch of boots on frozen dirt, was the steady breath of Ginger behind him. The big bay stallion followed like a shadow, unhaltered, moving in rhythm with Tobias, as if the two were bound by something older than habit. They didn't need words, hadn't for years. Ginger understood his place in the world better than most men Tobias had ever met. He was there for the long days fencing the upper pasture, the blizzards that drove them to share the warmth of the barn, the moments when silence hung too heavy after Tobias buried his wife beneath the cottonwoods. The horse was more than a companion. He was family. The last thing left Tobias trusted, without reservation. So when Ginger favored his left hind leg for the second time in a week, Tobias noticed. At first it was subtle, a hesitation on the slope behind the north paddock, a pause too long at the water trough. But that morning, when Tobias crouched beside him to check his shoes, he saw it again. The lump, about the size of a fist now, just above the fetlock, swollen, taut beneath the winter coat. Ginger flinched, not sharply, but enough to freeze Tobias's hand in place. The stallion's eye shifted sideways, glinting under the early light. There was pain there, and something else. Shame, maybe. Tobias stood slowly, brushing his hand over Ginger's withers. "What are you carrying in there, boy?" he murmured, the words barely more than breath. "And why's it got you acting like you did something wrong?" That night, sleep didn't come. The wind whispered through the eaves of the cabin, rattling loose shutters like bones. Tobias sat on the porch, wool blanket across his shoulders, a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands. Ginger stood still in the pasture beyond, his dark frame barely visible in the moonlight. He didn't move, just stood, head low, like he was listening for something the world hadn't said yet. "You carried me through more storms than I can count," Tobias said softly. "And now I don't know how to carry this." A memory stirred, uninvited, unwanted. Korea, a mountain trail thick with fog and blood. Mules refusing to take another step. Men yelling, swearing, tugging at reins until a shell hit 30 yards ahead, right where they would have been. That day, Tobias had learned to trust what animals knew before men did. He hadn't forgotten. By morning, the decision was made. He saddled Ginger carefully, easing the cinch slower than usual, whispering apologies under his breath. The horse didn't resist. They rode out as the sky turned gold, hooves crunching frost, the wind sharp enough to sting. The trail to Cedar Hollow was long, winding through canyons and up the eastern slope of the valley. Aspens flashed silver as they passed, and hawks circled above like they were waiting for something to fall. Tobias rode with a weight that had nothing to do with the saddle. He wasn't chasing a cure anymore. He was chasing a truth. Doc Whitmore's clinic wasn't much to look at. Just the back end of the general store, tarps strung across fence posts, and the tang of iodine in the air. The vet was already elbow-deep in a calf's side when Tobias arrived. He barely glanced up. "McCoy," he grunted. "Ain't seen you in town since the fire last spring. What brings you in?" Tobias nodded toward Ginger. "He's got a lump." "Ain't right." Whitmore cleaned up, pulled on fresh gloves, and approached the stallion. He was an old war horse himself, grizzled beard, fingers twisted by arthritis, but his eyes still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He patted Ginger's flank gently, speaking low as he worked his way down the leg. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The moment his fingers touched the lump, Ginger shifted. Not much, but it was there, a shiver through the muscle, a twitch of the ears. Whitmore frowned, his hand stilled. "Feel that?" Tobias nodded. "It ain't soft," the vet said slowly. "It ain't fluid either. Hell, that's solid." He pressed gently, then stepped back, tugging off the glove. "I've cut out all kinds of garbage from animals' old bullets, bone spurs, even a belt buckle once, but I ain't never felt anything like that." Tobias looked down at the leg, the tension in his shoulders rising. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that ain't no ordinary tumor." Whitmore's voice was low now, almost reverent. "Tobias, this thing, it feels man-made." There was a silence between them, thick enough to choke on. And somewhere beneath the stretched skin of Ginger's leg, something waited just to be removed, but to be discovered. The wind had picked up by late afternoon, dragging the scent of dry sage across Cedar Hollow as Tobias stood with a hand resting on Ginger's neck. The stallion was sedated but upright, nostrils flaring slightly from the sting of the injection. Dr. Whitmore knelt beside the hind leg, his weathered fingers moving with more care than usual as he cleaned the site around the swelling. The tarp overhead flapped, casting broken light over the improvised clinic, but Tobias barely noticed. His focus never left Ginger, not for a second. "You sure you're ready for this?" Whitmore asked, flicking a glance up. "I didn't come this far to turn back now," Tobias said, jaw tight. Whitmore didn't reply. He just took a steady breath, picked up the scalpel, and leaned in. The first cut slid easier than expected. The skin, already stretched thin by the mass beneath, parted with minimal resistance. Tobias held Ginger's head, whispering to him even though the horse could barely hear. The connection between man and animal, unspoken, unshakable, was a comfort even now. Tobias's other hand was clenched in his coat pocket, knuckles white. Then Whitmore froze. His shoulders went still, his breath hitched. "Doc?" Tobias said. Whitmore leaned back slowly. "Sweet mercy," he whispered. Instead of blood or pus, a pale, oily sheen emerged from the incision, followed by a faint shimmer beneath the surface. Whitmore widened the opening with careful fingers. The lantern light caught it again, something hard, faceted, glinting blue. "That ain't no bone spur," Whitmore muttered. "That's a damn gemstone." Tobias blinked. "What?" The vet reached in carefully, withdrawing a small leather-wrapped bundle no bigger than a matchbox. It was tied tight with waxed thread, the surface slick from its years under flesh. Whitmore set it on a cloth, then reached back in. Another, and another. By the time he had removed 4 bundles, Tobias stepped back, a cold sweat breaking down his spine. His hand hovered over the first pouch, hesitant. When he finally opened it, a gasp caught in his throat. Inside were 3 cut gemstones, an emerald, a ruby, and a sapphire, each flawless, polished to brilliance. They glowed in the lamplight like drops of frozen fire. He turned one over in his fingers, half expecting it to vanish. It didn't. "You're telling me," Tobias said slowly, "someone surgically stuffed jewelry inside my horse?" "Not just jewelry," Whitmore said, lifting one stone with his tweezers, holding it to the light. "These are professionally cut, maybe museum grade. Whoever put them there knew what they were doing, and they weren't just hiding these for fun." Tobias staggered back, almost knocking over the saddle stool behind him. The world tilted sideways. He'd bought Ginger 8 years ago at an auction outside Cheyenne. The seller had been quiet, hands like a gambler's, eyes that flicked over his shoulder too often. The horse had been healthy, powerful, but came with no papers. "Call him whatever you want," the man had said. "He's got more in him than you'll ever know." Tobias had figured it was just horse trader nonsense. Now he wasn't so sure. More bundles emerged, some tightly rolled, others square, all wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved their contents with eerie precision. When Whitmore opened the largest, the men went silent. Inside were 8 more stones-deep blue sapphires, each the size of a thumbnail. Tobias turned away, his eyes falling on Ginger. The stallion stirred slightly under sedation, one ear flicking. There was no blood on the floor, no signs of distress, just the quiet weight of truth settling over the stable like dusk. And that's when Tobias saw it. Ginger was watching him. Even half-drugged, the stallion's gaze was locked onto Tobias. There was no fear in it, just something older, wiser, as if the animal knew this was always going to happen, that the burden he'd carried had always been more than just flesh and blood. Tobias took a shaky breath, stepping outside into the crisp air. He leaned against the hitch rail and stared at the darkening sky. The wind pulled at his coat like ghost hands. Behind him, Whitmore continued working in silence. Back at the ranch that night, Tobias placed the gemstones on his kitchen table, each one carefully unwrapped and cleaned. They sparkled beneath the oil lamp, casting rainbow fragments on the walls. He didn't touch them, just watched. Ginger stood outside the window, head bowed, breathing fog onto the glass. His silhouette loomed like a sentinel. The stones were beautiful, impossibly so. No rancher needed this kind of wealth. And yet, here it was, hidden for years in the leg of the one creature Tobias trusted above all. He poured a whiskey, sat down, and listened. That's when he heard it. Not a noise, not a whisper, but a sense. Movement on the ridge. He blew out the lamp and stepped to the door, rifle in hand. The moon was bright enough to outline the trees beyond the pasture, and on the far edge, just above the timberline, a figure on horseback sat watching. Not moving, just watching. Tobias narrowed his eyes. Whoever they were, they'd come for the horse, or what had been inside him, and they were waiting. The figure on the ridge didn't move, didn't blink, just sat in silence like a stitched shadow against the pines. Tobias stood on his porch for a long time, boots planted firm on the planks, rifle across his arms. Ginger remained still too, as if waiting for something. Ears pointed toward the dark rider, head tilted just slightly, like he recognized an old tune faintly heard through fog. Come sunrise, the rider was gone. Tobias didn't sleep. He sat at the table most of the night, the gemstones still laid out like a constellation of fire. When the sun finally split the horizon, he boiled coffee so strong it could have peeled paint, poured it into a tin cup, and walked out to the corral. Ginger met him with that familiar nudge, like he was trying to say, "I know you don't understand yet, but you will." By mid-morning, hoofbeats echoed again, not distant and ominous this time, but slow, deliberate, close. Tobias stepped off the porch as a rider approached from the trail below the ridge. An old man in a wide-brimmed hat and travel-worn duster came into view, moving with the stiffness of someone who had spent more nights on a saddle than a mattress. His horse was lean, his saddle scuffed, and his expression unreadable. The man stopped 20 feet from the corral, removed his hat, and looked directly at Ginger. "His name's Treasure," he said softly. That was her name for him. Tobias felt his throat tighten. Most folks call him Ginger. The old man nodded. I figured you might. But that horse remembers. Watch him. As if on cue, Ginger turned his head. He looked at the stranger for a long, quiet beat, then walked forward. Not frantic, not fearful, but drawn, like a needle to its compass. Tobias gripped his rifle but didn't lift it. You got a name? He asked. Ezra Caldwell, the man said, sliding off his saddle. He groaned slightly, dusted his coat, and added, I ain't here to take nothing you ain't willing to give. That's good, Tobias said. 'Cause I ain't in the mood to be taken from. Ezra didn't answer. He walked to the fence, and Treasure Ginger rested his head gently over the rails, nuzzling the old man's chest. Ezra laid his hand on the horse's brow and closed his eyes. When he opened them, they shimmered not with tears, but with the weight of years. Been tracking him for near a decade, he said. Knew he was still alive after he got rustled from my property back east. Just didn't know how far he'd gone. Tobias crossed his arms. You said his name was Treasure. Why? Ezra pulled a weathered pouch from his coat and opened it. Inside, he unfolded a yellowed photo of a woman with bright eyes, smiling as she held a gemstone up to the light. Her hands were small, her fingers delicate but steady, focused. Next to her stood a younger Ezra, proud, hopeful. Between them, a bay colt barely tall enough to peek over the railing. My wife Elizabeth, he said. Best gem cutter I ever knew. Saw beauty in things no one else noticed. Said everything. Stone, person, animal. Had a shine buried inside. Just needed the right cut to let it out. Tobias stared at the photo, then back at Ginger. War came, Ezra continued. Property lines didn't matter, nor titles. Looters took anything with shine. We packed what we could, buried what we couldn't. But her best work, her private pieces, she couldn't bear to leave them behind. Ezra's hands shook slightly as he returned the photo to his pocket. So we did something desperate, he said. I found a field vet with steady hands and no questions. Paid him more than I could afford. He helped us hide them. Inside the one creature we knew would survive. Treasure. The strongest, smartest colt Elizabeth ever raised. Tobias swallowed. She let you do that to him. She chose it, Ezra said, voice firm. She said the gems meant nothing without a future, and if Treasure could carry them somewhere safe, they'd still have a chance. She died a year later. Fever. He paused, looked down at the dirt, then looked back at Ginger. I promised her I'd find him, bring the stones back together, do what we couldn't finish. Tobias didn't speak. The silence sat between them like a third person too heavy to ignore, too sacred to break casually. I'm not asking for the horse, Ezra said. Not after what you've clearly done for him. He looks whole, strong, cared for. Elizabeth would have liked that. But you want the stones, Tobias said. Ezra nodded. They're all I've got left of her hands, her art, her eyes. You've seen 'em, you know they're not just rocks. Tobias turned his gaze to the corral. Ginger had returned to the far side, grazing like none of this mattered. But it did. The old stallion carried more than weight in his leg. He carried love, memory, and a promise sealed in blood and quiet vows. You could sell those gems for a fortune, Ezra said gently. And I wouldn't blame you. You got no reason to believe a word I'm saying, but I came here with the truth. Tobias finally met his eyes. And if I say no? Ezra smiled, sad, but not angry. Then I'll get back on that trail and ride off. and I'll thank God someone good ended up with him." There was a long pause. "I ain't here to take," Ezra added, "just to ask." Tobias turned and walked into the cabin without a word. He came back with a cigar box lined in velvet, opened it in the morning light. Inside, every stone Whitmore had removed. They caught the sunlight like they belonged to the sky itself. Ezra's breath caught. "My lord," he whispered. But Tobias didn't hand them over, not yet. "I ain't decided," he said. "Not yet. But I needed to see your face when you saw them, and I needed to know if this was about money or love." Ezra nodded, eyes misting. "It's always been about her." The two men stood facing each other, the distance between them lined with gravel, years, and heartbreak. Behind them, Ginger neighed softly, then walked up and gently rested his head between both men, bridging the gap. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. But in that still moment, a decision began forming, one not yet spoken aloud, but etched quietly in the hearts of men who had both carried loss long enough to recognize it in someone else's eyes. That night, Tobias didn't sleep. The silence in the cabin seemed to echo louder than ever, bouncing off the logs like voices he couldn't ignore. The stones were still on the table, spread in a constellation of fire and weight. Some shimmered with blue like morning frost, others with the kind of red that made a man think of old blood and promises broken. He sat in his chair, hunched forward, arms resting on his knees, staring at them like they might blink first. What would he even do with them? Build a bigger barn? Buy more cattle? Retire? He tried to imagine that life a porch swing, a dog by the door, maybe a hired hand to tend the fields. But none of it felt like him. Not really. The only life he'd ever built was with Ginger beside him, fence post by fence post, season by season. These stones didn't belong to him, no matter how long he'd carried them unknowingly. At some point past midnight, he stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, thin, and laced with sagebrush. Ginger stood near the corral fence, silhouetted by moonlight, head low, eyes closed. Tobias walked over slowly, his boots crunching over frost-bitten grass. He rested a hand on Ginger's shoulder, felt the steady breath of the stallion under his palm. "What do you think?" Tobias whispered. "You carried her legacy farther than most men ever could. Maybe it's time I carried a little of it too." Ginger didn't answer, of course, but he lifted his head slightly, nudged Tobias's shoulder once just enough to make a point. By morning, a thin veil of fog rolled through Deadwood Ridge, blurring the trees and sky into a soft watercolor. Tobias had coffee on the stove and the cigar box packed, every stone wrapped carefully in cloth. When Ezra rode up, he looked older than he had the day before. Like hope had made him younger for a while, and sleep had taken it back. He dismounted with a wince and approached slowly. "I ain't here to pressure," he said right away. "I know," Tobias replied, handing him a tin mug of coffee. "But I've got something for you." Ezra accepted the coffee with shaking hands. Tobias motioned him toward the porch, then returned to the table and came back carrying the cigar box. He opened it between them. "These are yours," Tobias said. "They always were." Ezra's mouth parted slightly. His hand hovered above the box, as if afraid touching them would make them vanish. "You sure?" Tobias nodded. "You already paid." Ezra looked up, brows drawn. "I brought no money." "You brought a story," Tobias said, his voice low, calm. "And you brought a truth I didn't even know I needed to hear." Ezra sat down hard on the steps, as if the relief had knocked the wind out of him. He slowly began unwrapping each stone again, his fingers reverent, She made these with her own hands, he murmured. Cut 'em in a tiny room above our shop with tools she sharpened herself. Always said a gem was like a soul. Every one of 'em had a shape waiting to be freed. Ginger wandered closer. He stood behind Tobias and looked down at Ezra like an old friend, recognizing a traveler returned from far away. You know, Ezra said, voice rough with emotion. I used to think treasure was just a vessel for safekeeping. But seeing him here, he's more than that. He carried her spirit longer than I did. Tobias knelt beside the old man, placing a hand on his shoulder. And he's still got a job to do here. He's home now, with me, and I think she'd be okay with that. Ezra nodded slowly, a tear sliding unchecked down one cheek. I got one last thing, he said, reaching into his saddlebag. He pulled out a small pouch, the leather so worn it looked like silk. Inside were a dozen stones, larger, more brilliant than the others. These were hers. She cut them for herself. They were never meant to be sold, just admired. Tobias reached to take the pouch, but stopped. I can't accept these. You can, Ezra said, because you kept the others safe, and because I want her spirit to stay here too, in the land, in the horse, in the man who reminded me why she made beauty in the first place. Tobias said nothing, but accepted the pouch, cradling it like a gift more precious than money. For the first time since the surgery, something settled inside him, a calmness, like a river that finally found its bed. Ezra mounted slowly, his knees protesting, his face full of light despite the years carved into it. You ever make it back east? Look for the Caldwell School, he said. I'll be the old fool teaching kids how to find light in the rough. Tobias chuckled. You'll do good, Ezra. As Ezra turned to go, Ginger stepped up to the corral fence again. Ezra reached out, brushing his fingers gently across the stallion's muzzle. You carried her well, boy. Thank you. Tobias watched them, eyes narrowed against the light. Heart too full for words. The dust rose behind Ezra as he rode off, and for a long while, Tobias stood still. Later that night, he returned to the table, opened the pouch Ezra had left. He laid the stones out under the lamp reds like blood, greens like pine needles in snow, blues like evening sky after rain. He didn't touch them, just looked. Outside, Ginger lay in the grass beneath a sky full of stars, the scar on his leg barely visible now. The ranch was quiet. The mountains stood guard. And Tobias McCoy, once a man of silence and solitude, now carried a story not just in his memory, but in every breath. Autumn fell soft and golden over Deadwood Ridge. The sharpness of summer heat gave way to the kind of cool that whispered promises of frost. Mornings began with a crunch underfoot and the sound of geese overhead. Life slowed, as it always did this time of year. But for Tobias McCoy, something had shifted deeper than the season. He moved with more ease, spoke a bit more freely to Ginger, and sometimes even let the old record player hum through the cabin while he cooked. The gemstone pouch Ezra had left behind rested in a small carved box on the mantel, not for profit, not for show, but as a quiet tribute to a woman he'd never met who had seen beauty before anyone else could. Ginger's leg healed clean, save for a faint scar like a pale ribbon curling above the fetlock. Ranch hands and neighbors who'd heard snippets of the tale started calling it the jewel mark. Some of the old-timers said it carried luck. Others said it was proof that God put his mark on those who carried burdens and never buckled. Either way, Ginger walked with the same proud, steady gait he always had, just a little lighter now, as if a weight far greater than stone had finally lifted. The story spread first in whispers at cattle auctions, then in earnest across fence posts and front porches. Folks talked about the horse who carried treasure and the rancher who gave it all away. And like all good stories, it grew legs. Some said the stones were cursed. Others said Tobias found more and kept them buried. But none of that mattered to him. He knew the truth was enough. One breezy afternoon, Tobias received a letter, postmarked from Virginia. He opened it slowly on the porch with a mug of black coffee in hand, Ginger dozing in the corral nearby. The envelope was thick with careful handwriting, Ezra's. Inside was a short note and a photograph. The letter read, "Dear Tobias, the Caldwell School of Lapidary Arts is open now. Small place, just a storefront and a workbench. But we've got 6 students, orphans and drifters mostly. Kids with sharp eyes and steady hands. Elizabeth would have loved them. I show them how to find the heart in the stone, just like she taught me. Every gem they cut carries her initials on the ledger. I think of treasure often, not as something I lost, but as a chapter that kept her dream alive when everything else had gone quiet. Thank you for your generosity, your honor, and your heart. May the West treat you kindly. Ezra Caldwell." Tobias stared at the photo. It showed Ezra standing beside 3 young apprentices, 2 girls, one boy each holding up a freshly cut gem to the light, like it was something holy. Behind them, a wooden sign read, "Caldwell and Company, Gem Cutting and Craftsmanship." Below that, scrawled in smaller letters, "Beauty lives in the revealed, not the hidden." Tobias let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and tapped it against his palm a few times before tucking it into the inside pocket of his coat. Then he stood and walked out to Ginger. The stallion raised his head the moment he saw him, trotting over with a nicker. Tobias leaned against the fence, one boot resting on the bottom rail. "You did good, boy," he murmured. "Better than I ever deserved." Ginger pressed his forehead to Tobias's chest, staying there for a long moment. The wind picked up, rustling the aspens and sending a handful of yellow leaves skittering across the yard. Off in the distance, the mountains were brushed in purple shadow, the sky bleeding orange above them. Later that week, during the town's fall roundup gathering, a couple of ranch kids asked about Ginger's scar. Tobias knelt down, looked them in the eye, and told them the truth, not the treasure part, but the heart of it. This here horse once carried something special for a long, long time. Not gold, not silver, something a whole lot harder to protect someone's dream. And he carried it like it was his own. The kids listened wide-eyed. One of them asked, "Did he know what he was carrying?" Tobias smiled. Maybe not the weight of it, but he knew it mattered. That night, back at the ranch, Tobias sat on the porch with a blanket across his lap and the stars so bright they looked like spilled sugar across the black sky. Ginger stood near the ridge, head turned eastward, ears twitching at something only he could hear. Tobias followed his gaze. Somewhere out there, a man was keeping a promise, and a woman's work was shining in the hands of children who'd never known her name. He stood slowly, walked across the yard, and laid a hand on Ginger's shoulder. The scar beneath his palm was barely raised anymore, but Tobias felt it all the same. "You didn't just carry treasure, boy," he whispered. "You were the treasure." Ginger turned his head and nudged Tobias's arm, soft and familiar. The two of them stood like that for a long time, bathed in starlight, silent and sure, rooted in a story that had started as a mystery and ended as something sacred. And in the hush of that Wyoming night, Under the watchful eye of the mountains, a rancher and his horse stood together, not just as man and beast, but as keepers of a legacy carved in stone, bonded not by blood or coin, but by the quiet courage to do what was right. What an incredible secret Ginger carried. Wouldn't you agree? If you were captivated by this tale of loyalty and unexpected fortune, please give us a thumbs up. And for more untold stories of courage and community from across the American West, be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. We've got so many more treasures waiting to be uncovered. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.